To glaze or not to glaze, that is the question when you're getting ready for a wood firing. The surfaces of a ceramic form can be beautifully ornamented by natural ash deposit and the vapors that come from the volatilized chemicals in the ash. So natural ash glazing is something that is highly prized and can be really dramatic and very wonderfully have a wonderful asymmetry. So we don't glaze as much as we do put in pieces unglazed. So I end up putting into the kiln about 2 pieces that are unglazed for every piece that I glaze. That being said, I'm going to show you some of the most dramatic results I ever get from glazing. So you have to think about, for every piece I show you, there's probably 100, not so dramatic, but I do want to emphasize the possibilities. So this is a piece glazed with Glaze Shino. I don't get this opalescent color very often, but when I do, it's from the piece being low to the floor and towards the back of the anagama chamber is where I see this. About 2/3 into the kiln on the other side, on the far side of the side stoke area. So this is Glaze Shino fired on the floor of the anagama chamber, a bit distant from the wood. And here's a piece just to demonstrate the wonders of a non-glazed form. This is a piece that is completely natural ash glazed. In other words, everything you see is the result of the ash from the wood that is burning being carried into the kiln and landing on the piece. So we're going to look at glazes, slips, and stains for wood fire to some extent. Here is a wonderful combination of both glaze and the natural ash. And that's really the point. You know, we think about clays in terms of how responsive they are to the flame and the ash. And we can think about glazes in the same way. Because glazes are highly fluxed, the results may be often more subtle. In this case, not really. This is quite dramatic. This piece actually probably is covered with a flashing Shino slip, which we'll talk more about. But so it's a more of a clay-like substance than it is a glaze. And my particular favorite part of this piece is this front indent here where it's created a little shelf and you can see a buildup of ash. Very beautiful kind of color and texture change just from the ash landing on that shelf. This is a piece with flashing Shino slip on it, and you can see that it's got a number of things going on. It's got the slip underneath creating those white crackled surfaces, and then it's covered, inundated with natural ash, and which has been cooled fairly quickly, so it's shiny, and it's giving you also that well-reduced kind of jade-like green color. And then these breaks in it where these spots are from the Feldspathic rock that has been wedged into the clay. The trick with Feldspathic rock is not to use too much. Less is more. Initially, when I started working with this, everybody does this to emulate a clay body out of Japan called shigaraki clay. And it has feldspathic rock and quartz rock in it, little small pieces of it. And so everybody tries to simulate that, which is great, but at the same time, it doesn't occur in nature in tremendous quantities. It's more subtle, like this piece is a beautiful example. And you can see around each one of these little stones, the stone itself is fluxing, it's melting out because it's feldspar, and that's a melter at these temperatures, and so it's basically decomposed granite, and so it forms a little ring of clear glaze around each one of these little spots. Beautiful piece, I think. Here is one of my early favorites. It was flashing Shino slip in a firing. There was quite a bit of cracking. You can see 2 places where the piece actually cracked, but it's a dramatic crack. It has a kind of yamaware is the term you'll find in your book for that crack. So that is the piece with Shino slip. And this is another piece with Shino slip, and it looks like I'm not going to be able to show you the side of this piece, but this is the inside of the piece. And this is fired, the slip is inside the bowl, and then the bowl was fired upside down. So it gets just a blush. The slip is being blushed with the vapors from the volatilized chemicals from the ash. And the other thing that's happening is that the piece was wadded on top of a scallop shell. And scallop shells are a very interesting technique to use as a release agent. The way they work is, scallop shells are almost all calcium with just a touch of sodium. And calcium is a flux that makes silica turn to glass, but it only does so where it comes in physical contact with the clay. So when you use a scallop shell and put the bowl on top of that, the scallop shell itself, the top part of the scallop shell adheres to the silica and begins to turn the silica of the clay body into glass, and that glassifies that scallop shell, and you get the shape remaining. But 2/3 of the scallop shell isn't touching the clay, so it does not turn to glass, and it just turns to powder, and so the piece is easily separated. Here are a couple of vases that I made using stains and slips to do some painting on the pieces. And I think these demonstrate, for one thing, that it's not a particularly, that if you're going to do this kind of work where you're going to paint with slips and stains, and I think I used a little hikidashi, which is iron oxide and wood ash, if you're going to do that sort of thing, you need to keep the pieces pretty far back in the kiln. These got pretty overwhelmed by the ash deposits, so I don't think they were particularly successful. This is a piece that was glazed and fired to cone 10 with Oribe and iron painting in it. And you can look back and forth at it. You can see it was fired upside down, and it was fired underneath the firebox of the Rosinante kiln. And this is a special technique that gives you often all kinds of changes in color and texture. And I'll explain how that works with a few of the upcoming pieces, because I've got several of these to show you. Here's another one. What happens with these pieces is that this piece was a green glazed piece. I'll show you an example of what it looked like before it went into the kiln. It was glazed with green Oribe glaze. But the glaze turns red and it turns turquoise, and it bubbles up. So what's happening is the glaze is found, the piece itself is placed upside down on a brick under the firebox, and it begins to get buried in embers. It heats the bowl up, the glaze starts to melt, but then it gets buried in embers. And those embers are surrounding it and creating little micro zones of reduction. So little oxidation, little reduction. So you get a tremendous variance of color across these pieces. And here's what that bowl might look like going into the kiln. Green glaze with white clear areas with iron painting on them. So that's pretty much what the Oribe style looks like. And then these other pieces. Here's another one that I can show you. Now this piece was fired in Denmark, and it got a little too close to the firebox, and so there was a lot of erosion involved. But probably the takeaway here is you see that bright turquoise. That is sometimes what happens with the Lancet Oribe glaze. So that's what you're seeing there, is just an incredibly bright turquoise color. Because of the heavy calcium in the wood ash, the calcium tends to make the copper in the Oribe glaze turn turquoise. And it'll do that within the kiln itself as well. You can get some turquoise and reds. Here's another glazed piece put underneath the firebox, and then this was all green, and you can see again that micro reduction from the embers piling up, working very powerfully to make a variety of color. This is a flashing Shino slip piece. This kind of bruised orange color is very rare. I've probably gotten it 3 or 4 times over the years. And it seems to occur again on the floor very close to the exit flues in the back of the anagama chamber, and sometimes just inside the Niborigama chamber as well. So those are some possible areas that this occurs, and it occurs at a lower temperature. It doesn't happen at the very high cone 13 temperatures. So it has to be further back in the kiln and a bit away from the actual wood, burning wood of the firing. Here's another view of it. And here is a Shino glazed piece, and you can see with a slow cooling that these little spots that you see on the kiln are actually crystal growth that happens in the cooling. And you can see also some carbon trapping and some ash impingement. And a dramatic change of color on the inside that is primarily just experiencing the vapors from the chemicals in the ash, the volatilized chemicals. So it is acting very much like a clay body might respond. Here's an example of a Shino with more subtle effects from the firing. Some Shinos are formulated to stay very white. This one is an Ian Curry #1 Shino. The recipe is in the book. Japanese wood-fired ceramics. And this is a very similarly glazed piece with a glossier Shino. This is most likely a braise Shino or something like that, a very glossy Shino. So you can see quite a difference between a Shino which is formulated to stay white in the impact of the ash. And in the Shino tradition, what is usually done is that the bowls are loaded in sagers, so they're completely contained and they do not get exposed to the ash in any way. But my preference is to keep the Shino bowls exposed to all the ash and do what the Japanese call Oni Shino. Oni means demon, so demon Shino, kind of polluted and dirtied by the ash. And here is another discovery. This is Temmoku. The Temmoku is a glaze that is black when it's thick and brown where it's thin, but in the wood kiln you get these amazing effects, and this is a kind of rabbit fur effect, but you can also get these kind of golden glowing hues as well. Here's another example of a Oni Temmoku tea bowl. You can see the black quality of the glaze inside the bowl, right in here. And then it's just glazed with Temmoku, and all of these colors and textures are brought about by the interaction with the fly ash from the fire. And here's an example of that kind of beautiful, it's almost a vibrating and iridescent yellow gold, very gorgeous color. Now this only occurs in the very back of the kiln as well. This has to happen towards the very back of the anagama, and in this case preferably up towards the top of the anagama, way out of flame reach, but still needs to get some ash. And this piece is interesting. It has nothing on the outside, but it's lined with Lancet's Oribe glaze, the green, copper green glaze, and that pink color is from the copper migrating through the body of the piece during the firing and coloring, giving a pink-purple blush. Now, when you use Lancet's Oribe, the copper is one of the first elements to vaporize in a kiln, and so any copper glaze that you use will also turn pieces downstream of your piece, pink and sometimes red, purplish colors. Here's a piece where you can see in the crevices, the Shino glaze on the outside is kind of yellow gold, almost honey colored, But in the crevices where ash has been allowed to build up, it's getting to be a very green color. And this is again a Shino slip with some Feldspathic stone and very heavily inundated with ash, so you can almost not tell that there was Shino involved at all. So the question about to glaze or not to glaze is an important one, and one to think about. I have found that I am equally fascinated by unglazed forms and glazed forms. Whereas when I first started out, I was kind of a purist and I wouldn't do any glazing or very little glazing. And it wasn't until I began to experiment that I realized how many variations and possibilities that glaze present. So I'm pretty much doing it all now. And there's some other kinds of techniques that you can be involved with. Here there's some wild grasses placed on the pieces to see if that will give any effect. Here you can see a close-up of the fire grate that I've been talking about in the side stoking area, and you can see up on the left there, you can actually see the sunlight coming through the side stoke. And so that's where the wood comes in, and you need about 18 inches minimum. And so I try to create some kind of grate, some kind of standing grate that will, out of vases where the wood will be thrown directly on here. And sometimes pieces will break, not always, but sometimes. But that will give us quite a fine opportunity for oxygen to get under the wood, and you need the oxygen to have access to the wood for a hotter burn. So another picture of it in a little different light. Here I've shown you this elsewhere, but this is the idea of shaping wadding and stacking plates in order to get to engage the design of your plate in different ways. So there's some slip and stain decoration and some wadding decoration on these plates. This is a technique also I think we discussed elsewhere. Kathy Kern's working with this, where an intentional indentation is made on the form. The form is fired very level on its side so that the glass that is broken and placed into the indentation will melt and build up in that area and not run off the piece. And here, I think this is a little banana skin. We've tried banana skin, we've tried seaweed. You can do different things this way. To see any effect at all, you really need to have the piece placed towards the back of the kiln. Otherwise, it'll just get overwhelmed with ash.